Okay, so from today onwards, I mean, yesterday we had the introduction to what is a web application and what are the components of a web application and what are the frameworks, what is front end, what is back end. We have discussed about all of these, and I hope it is clear to everyone, right? Or do you have any questions?
Sir.
Okay. Okay, good.
Yes.
So as I had already mentioned that we would be going through a framework called Flask, right? In order to build our web applications, we'll be using Flask. In Python, there are two major frameworks. One is Flask, another one is called Django, right? Um, Let me show that to you as well. Right, so the another one is Django framework. So the both are pretty famous. Either we can go with the Flask or go with the Django. Both are good frameworks, right? So we'll be going with the Flask for our course, right? Now, what is Flask? Right, so Flask, it is a micro web development framework, right? Micro web development framework. Now, using this framework, you can develop a web application. You can develop a web application, right? You can just see here, just search on Google Flask, say Python, right? So you will land up on these links. And the first link, if you can try, right? So this is the Flask frameworks official documentation page. Okay, so here, right? So Flask, you can read about the Flask and just try to understand what is what, right? If you see, right, the quick start tutorial, everything you have here, right? So everything, yep. The complete, if you want to learn, you can just go through this page and then you can just start building, learning day by day, right? So for example, you can just minimal application, debug mode, HTML escaping. You can learn by each day, you can learn one concept. But yeah, so we will be going through this Flask, and we would go through and build a proper web application by the end of this course, right? Okay. Right, so Flask is basically a micro framework to build a web applications, to build a web applications, right? So let me, right. Okay, so what is the framework that we are using?
Flask.
Flask, Flask. This is the framework name. Okay, right. So there are several versions in this. So we would be using version 2.0. We'd be using version 2.0. Clear?
Yes, sir. Yes,
There are
sir.
several versions in it, right? The latest version is, I guess, 2.3. If you see here in the Flask, so what is the latest version? 2.3, right? So you have 2.3, 2.2, 2.1, and 2.0. So these are all the versions, and the latest one is 2.3. So we will learn 2.0. We'll be installing 2.0 and we'll be learning that. Okay, today we will look at install what is a Flask, right? So installing a Flask, how do we install Flask, right? How do you set up a virtual environment? How do you write a basic Flask application with simple response and adding certain URLs, right? And how do I run a Flask development server, right? And how do I access this from the browser? How do I access this from the browser? Right. To start with, let us do one thing. Let's go build. Let's start with the fresh project. Okay, let's start with a fresh project. So what I'm going to do here, um, I'm going to say new project. I'm going to say new project from here, right? And I'm going to say Flask development is my project name, and I am going to create a virtual environment. Okay, if you don't want a virtual environment, let us say, right, previously configured. No, so let's go with the virtual environment. So this would basically create a virtual environment as well, right? And we'll say create, and I want to open it in the same window, right? Right. So since this is one project, right? So I'm going to have a virtual environment. This is the VN. The virtual environment is created by the PyCharm itself, and it is basically called VN, right? And when I open the terminal, that is activated by default. That is activated by default, right? Even if it is right, even if it is deactivated, we can always activate how? How do you activate a virtual environment? Right? This is the script. Do not forget, we have already seen this, and if you are not answering, meaning you did not practice, please kindly practice so that you know what we are doing here. Okay, so if I say pip freeze, initially it doesn't have anything, right? Now we are going to install pip install Flask. I'm going to install 2.0 version. Flask double equal to 2.0. So this will go and install 2.0 Flask version. Now if I just say pip freeze, right, this is going to show me it has installed Flask 2.0. Right, and Flask internally depends on various other libraries and packages, right? It gets all of the dependent packages and installs as well. When we install Flask also installs all the dependent packages, which is in this, which is important. Flask obviously is important. Another one is Jinja2, another one is Werkzeug. It's called Werkzeug. Okay, so these are the important packages that are required, and we just install Flask, and Flask install all its dependent packages. Are we clear so far?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
going to
Clear, sir.
I'm going to create, right, pip freeze, and this is the redirection symbol. I'm going to create I'm going to redirect this output to a file called, and I'm going to create that as a requirements.txt. If you see here, that got created here, and these are all the packages that has been installed so far. So we installed Flask, and Flask installed all the dependent libraries. Okay, now we are going to write our first. Now we have installed our Flask. We are good to go, right? Now let us write our first app, first application. I'm going to call this as app.py, app.py. Now, first thing is I have to import Flask. From Flask, import a Flask class. Import Flask class. And I'm going to create an object out of this. App is equal to Flask, right? And I can name anything. So I'm going to name this as, for now, I'm just going to leave the same name as the file name, right? You know what is underscore underscore name, right? We have seen this, right? So this basically installs a application. This basically creates an instance of the Flask app. It creates an instance of the Flask app, and we can run this as, how can we run this? Just say, let me just run normal like an app, right? So it is saying I have printed this app, and it says it is a Flask, right? This app is of type Flask because it is an instance of type Flask. Yes, we have created a Flask. Now the app I can use this app as app dot route. Route means I'm going to create a URL. I'm going to create a URL, which I'm just going to just mention it as a slash. And under that, I'm going to write my function. This is a decorator at the rate app dot route is a decorator. And I'm just specifying the path in it. I'm specifying the path in it. All I have to do is hello underscore world. It's my first application, first function, right? And this will just return, right? This will just return hello first Flask world. Now here, what I'm going to do is if underscore underscore name underscore underscore is equal to underscore underscore main, which means if I run this file directory, then say app dot app dot run. Okay, now what I will do, and now I will run this file. Right. I have started my development server. I have started my development server. Okay, serving Flask application app environment production warning. This is a development server. Do not use it in the production environment. It basically, right, has started a Flask server, has started a Flask server. Now, where is this running? It is running locally on 127.0.0.1 and Flask default port is 5000. Flask default port is 5000. Just like PostgreSQL has a default port. What is the PostgreSQL port number?
5432, sir.
5432.
5432, right? In the same way, as I told yesterday, every service will run on a particular port number. There is an IP address and then there is a port number. Here, our IP address is a 127.0.0.1, which is nothing but localhost, and colon is the port number. Flask by default runs on a port number called 5000. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this, right? Copy this and go back to the browser, right? And see what happens here. What does it say?
Hello,
Hello,
Flask world.
Flask world.
Which means, right, by default, this started running. And this is how you access any of the website, right? This is how you access. You go to the browser on the address bar, you do enter certain URL, which URL by URL you mean there is a particular domain name you will be using. And since it is our development server, we are going to use a IP address colon the port number colon the port number. And when I said 127.0.0.1, or I can call it as localhost, they are one and the same. And what is important is which is the port that it is running on. So if I just say 5001, it will just throw like the site cannot be reached because there is nothing running on 5001. But where are we running our apps Flask server? It is in 5000. All right. Now what happened here? If you see, right, we ran our Flask server, right? And we said this is the path that you have to reach, which means empty, just localhost colon 5000. If you come to that path, right, this route, this path, if it comes to that path, execute this function, execute this function. We are telling the Flask server that if somebody comes to this, right, the base path, it is called base path, it doesn't have anything associated with it, which is localhost colon 5000, and you don't have to give anything, which means it hits a base path. And if it hits a base path, we are telling the Flask application that we are registering this method, we are registering this method, which is hello world, to this particular path, to this particular path. If anybody comes to this path, call this function, and this function is returning hello Flask world, hello Flask world, right? Now let me just see if this is the function that is getting executed. I'm from hello world method. Now I'm going to, because I have made some change here, so I'm going to stop this server. and I have to restart the server again. I have to restart the server so that it takes the latest file. It takes this change now. Now let me go back to the browser. Right, I'm going to call this again, and let's go back to the browser. Sorry, Flask. And do we see this print statement here? I am from hello world method, which means if I have reloaded that particular path, which is the home path or the base path, right? This function is being called, it is printing that, and also it is returning that response, and also it is returning that response in the UI. Are we clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right? First thing is we have imported from Flask, import Flask. This is a class. Okay. From this, I'm going to create an instance and assigning that a variable called app. Right. Okay. Now from this, right, what I'm going to say is app at the rate app dot root, right? If anybody comes to the home, call this function. Right. From this, I'm going to say return. Right. This function returns. Now this returns. Now we have returned this and I have to run. I have to run this. Right. I'm going to just say app dot run. So now if I run this application, if I run this file, this is going to run this particular application, which is an instance of a Flask. And in that we have registered one method with this path. Now with this, if I go to a browser and type localhost or 127, whatever you can use, colon 5000 is the default port that our Flask application runs on, If I go to the browser and just type this much, right? And this is the path we are saying. What did we give here? Slash, right? This is the slash that we have given here. So this is my domain, right? This is my base, right? And in that, if there is a slash, right, and there is nothing, right, and there is a slash and there is nothing after that, which means if at all, if it comes to that URL, call this particular function, and this function is going to return this string. And if you go to the browser and execute this, it will just say, hi, I am a Flask app. Are we clear?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, right. So now that we know, we just created a new project, we installed Flask, and then we have developed a simple first development server, right? Now with this, right, you can add as many URLs as we want. We can add as many URLs as we want, right? So let me come back to the thing, class development server. I'm going to add one more URL. I have to register one more time. App dot route. Now this time what I'm going to say is slash home. I'm going to say slash home. home method called, and here I'm just going to return a HTML response. I'm going to return a HTML response. I'm going to close my h1 tag, right? And in fact, I can, right? Okay, let us come back to this, right? I'm going to save this, and I have to, since I have made some change, I have to stop the server again, restart the server so that it can take this change, Let me go back. Now this URL returns Flask hello world. Now we have added a new URL. Yes, is it slash home? If somebody comes to this URL, right? If somebody hits this URL, then this will trigger the home method, and this is where this is coming from. This is a home page by the Flask application. Are we clear?
Yes, sir.
Clear, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Now what I'm going to do here, since every time I make a change, I don't want to stop and start, right? So for that, Flask has given one simple rule. If you are using this for a development purpose, so which means whenever we make a change, it will immediately detect that change and it will restart itself. It will restart. We don't have to manually stop and restart. So if it detects a change, it is going to restart itself. So for that, I'm going to say debug in the run. I will pass a run method. I will pass a parameter called debug, and is equal to, I'm going to say true. Debug is equal to true. Now for the first time alone, I'm going to stop and start, right? And it says, see, debugger, right? It says it is opened in the debug mode, right? Now, if I make certain change, for example, I'm going to make a color here. Okay, now we just watch here what happens if I just save this file. Right? Did it restart? That's it. Detected
Yes.
change. Detected change in this file, and hence it is reloading. Right? Your application is reloaded. Now you can go back to the browser and just try to reload this. Now it will show up in the green color. Right? Now I'm going to add one more thing to that. I'm going to add a multi-line string so that I can write the HTML properly. This is my H1. Right. Let me take this guy. I'm going to make it as H2. Color I'll say blue. There's a homepage Flask application H2 tag. I'm opened in H2. I have to close the H2. Right. And I'm going to repeat a H3 tag. Right. Now, if you notice here, it has detected the change and it is reloading. Now let us go back to the browser. Now if I reload this, right, this is what we have returned from our Flask application. This is how generally the web application works, is that when you click, when you reach to a particular route, there is a certain method that is called in the programming, in the backend. right? In Python, we are using a Flask as a web framework, and your Flask is ensuring that it calls the respective method, right? Your Flask is ensuring that it will call this method. It will call this method home whenever we reach to this home, right? I'm going to add one more route. I'm going to add one more route, right? Route, and here I'm going to say slash user, right? And this is a dynamic user name, right? I'm going to pass this value here, this angle braces username in the browser. And whatever, this is a dynamic parameter in the path. This is called a path variable. This is a called what? Path variable, path variable. This path variable will be added into the function. Now this, whatever is passed in this particular path variable, the same would be passed as a parameter to this function. The same would be passed as a parameter to this function. So you have to use the same name as a path variable. Okay. Now return. I'm going to say just h1, right? Hi, and I'm going to use my f string here. To add a simple, probably a p tag. Mm, open any tag, we have to ensure we will close the tag as well. Right now, if anybody goes to this new dynamic variable, right? So what did we say? Slash user slash Raj, right? What does it say? Hi, Raj. If I just say, if I just say Archana, it says hi, Archana. If I just say moment, it just says hi moment, because this is a dynamic variable that I am passing from the browser in the path variable in the path. And this I'm taking it as a path variable here. I'm taking that as a path variable and I'm passing that to the function. And I'm using the same name that is being passed in the URL, right? In the response as well. And while returning the response, I'm passing the same variable in the response. So whatever name that I have entered in the path, that path is basically taken by this function. And I'm using the same variable, same value that is sent from the browser, right? Sending it back to the browser, right? Sending the same data back to the browser. Are we clear?
Clear, sir.
Clear, sir.
Yes. Clear.
Right? Let me add, with respect to the path variable, let me add one more thing. I'm going to call this as add. I'm going to take it as X, right? I'm going to take it as Y, right? And I'm expecting these to be numbers. So I'm going to take this as a parameter. Now there are two path variables. Yes, there are two path variables. And now those two path variables will be coming as a parameter to this, right? Now int of X plus int of Y, right? x right plus y is equal to int of x plus int of y. That would be the response. Right. So if somebody hits this URL, this function would be called and this response would be shown in the UI. Let me go back to the browser. What did we say? Add /10/20. Now it is going to respond with 10 plus 20 is equal to 30. Did we pass these variables from the browser?
Sir.
Right? 10,
Yes.
40. 10 plus
Yes,
40 is
sir.
equal to 50. Right? So this is how we can also take some dynamic variables, so which can be taken from the browser. Right, so this dynamic variable, which is very important if you want to take the variable from the URL path, so you have to give it within the angle braces, and whatever is passed there will be taken as a parameter to the function, and the same would be used to make any respective functionality, to bring in any respective functionality. Here I'm using them to add some convert to integer and sum. Now it is very simple, right? Now this can be thrown error easily. Now if I'm saying for 40, 50, yes, it is fine, it is working. If I send something else, now can I convert this WE into integer? What happens if I try to convert this?
It will throw error, sir.
Right, it will throw error. Now that is when we will get the response as a 500. That is when we'll get the response as 500. Now if you just see right in the network, right, so let me go back and say 20. Okay, now let us watch what happens in the network tab here. Right, so this is the URL localhost add 10/20, and this is the IP remote address. Yesterday, like what I was showing to you guys. Now I'm showing the same thing with respect to our application. Remote address is this IP address, and this is the port number, and the status code is 200, and this is the response. And what is the response for that call? This is what is returned from the backend. Yes, this is what is returned. And when it comes to the browser, whatever is returned, the HTML browser converts that to the appropriate representation. So since I have used the h1 tag add function, and there is a p tag, so it goes to the next line and displays this content. Right? So this HTML is understood by the browser. So what we have returned from the backend is this, right? This is exactly what we have returned. But when it comes to the browser, do you see h1 or p or something called style? You don't see anything because browser understood this HTML structure and it has been visualized in the same format. I said the add function should be in the h1, right? It has to be in the, by default it comes in the black color, right? And then within that I have added a p tag and I said color is orange and it is displayed, here. Okay, now this is successful, right? This is successful, right? I can go back to the headers and yes, this is wonderful, successful, right? Now, instead of this, I'm going to pass it as A, because when I try to convert that, right? When I try to convert that A into an integer type, we will get a value error. We will get a value error. And what is the status code here? If you see, 500 internal server error, because any of the backend error will result in a 500. 500 error means internal server error. Server error. There is some error in the server. There is some error in the server, internal to server, right? So technically, we should avoid maximum internal server errors. Right? When you write a code, you should ensure that you avoid internal server error. So now how do I handle this? Like, if I want to say like, boss, this has to be proper, then what I'm going to say is if x dot, if not x dot is digit or y dot is digit, or let's say if both are digit, right, only then return this response, right? Else, right, return, right? I'm going to p tag, I'm going to just say style is equal to colon red error, right? Invalid data. I'm ending my p tag. Now what happens if I just save this and go back to the browser? Right now, if I just try this, now I have handled this case. What does it say? Error, invalid data. But if you see from my server, I have handled it well, 200. Right? I'm not throwing any, uh, I am not stopping my server. I'm not causing an error. Right? I've handled, I know that it is possible that people might enter some certain wrong values in the URL. Right? I know I should handle this. If I just send like, the proper value, why is it saying invalid data? Both are digits, right? Add 10/10, both are digits, and why am I getting still the invalid data? They both are digits, right? If not, okay, so and I have to use not here, or else no, not. If both are digits, then this response, right? Otherwise, add function 10 plus 10, 20, right? If I give a, it says invalid data. If I add 20 or 10, whatever it works, add function 10 comma 10. So here instead of say something else I entered, it says invalid data. Now what is happening is that, right, it will ensure that only the digits it comes, it writes the proper response, otherwise it is giving invalid data. Isn't it simple? This is something that we have seen while writing normal functions. Now I just made you the use of certain string methods to handle this gracefully. Yeah, are we clear with this?
Clear, sir.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, now so far, right? So what we did was we returned certain HTML response. We returned certain HTML response. Now I don't want to embed my HTML into my code. I don't want to add certain HTML into my code. I want to create certain HTML file, and from there I want to return. From there I want to return that HTML that is being there. So for that, in the Flask, what you have to do is in the Flask, you have to create. So as part of the Flask project, so what I have done is that, so this is my project folder, right? First I have app.py. In the same level, I have to create another folder called templates. I have to create another folder called templates. Okay. Inside your project, create a directory called templates. Create a directory called templates, right? This directory will hold HTML files. This directory will hold what? HTML files, right? Within that, I'm going to create something called index.html. I'm going to create something as index.html, and from there we will try to you call this HTML and use it in the use it and use it in our API, which is app.route, and I'm going to call this particular, I'm going to render this HTML in the UI. Render means load this HTML in the UI. Okay, now this is what we have done, right? Right, so we will also do, okay, so let's start with this. Let's start with this. Okay, now in the same level where I have this app.py, I'm going to create a new directory and name it what? Templates, and name it templates. Under templates, I'm going to create something called HTML file, basically index.html. Right. So here in this HTML, because when I create HTML, this basic data would be there, right? This basic data Flask, I'm going to say Flask application. Flask, I'm going to say Flask web application, right? And I'm going to have a body, and within the body, I'm going to have one h1 tag, right? One h1 tag, and within that, I'm going to write certain. This is the HTML page. Okay, right? So this is a simple HTML. This is a simple HTML. Now what I'm going to do here is in my Flask, right? In the let me go back to my application, right? So from the Flask, there is another function which we need. From Flask import render template, import render template, which means this render template function looks at a folder. Do I have a folder called templates? And within that, if I have a in whatever the HTML file name that I give, it checks that if it has that file, it is going to render that file into app dot route, and I'm going to call it as index. I'm going to call it this as slash index. So if somebody goes to this particular URL, and this is going to render this is going to render this, right? So what does it say? I'm going to create a function def index, right? Def index. Yep. And I'm going to say return render template, and I have to pass my template name. What is my template name? Index.html, index.html. This is my template name, right? And that's it. I'm going to save this, and then this will restart. Let me go back to the browser. And now here, I'm going to open this new tab, localhost 5000 slash index. Now, when I do that, now if you see here, if you notice properly, this is rendering the HTML page. This is rendering the HTML page. This is the reading from this HTML file and rendering that. So what it requires is you have to mandatorily, you are not telling go look into the templates page. Are you saying? You are just saying index render template index.html. Now, how does Flask know that it has to look into the templates? Because Flask insists, Flask orders or tells us that create a folder called templates, and within that only you add all your HTML. You add all your HTML. So for example, do we have index.html, index1.html in this templates? Do we have that?
No, sir.
Right now, if it is not there, this is going to throw an error, right? Because this URL will try to call this function, and this function says render return render template index1.html. It goes and tries to find index1 in this templates. It doesn't find, but that is why it says template not found, template not found. It said render index render template not found, right? So if it says template not found, meaning that respective HTML is not there in the templates folder. That respective HTML is not there in the templates folder. So either there is a spelling mistake in what you have written, or genuinely that file that you are looking for is not present. So let us give a proper name and save it. Let's go back to the browser and try to reload. Now it works. It goes to that particular browser, the particular templates folder, finds index.html and returns this particular HTML response to the browser, and HTML is understood by the browser. Yeah, and renders this data. Okay. Right, in the same Flask project alongside the templates, let's create another directory called, and we call it as static, and we are going to call it as static. Okay, so here you can maintain all your CSS files or images, any of that information, CSS, JavaScript, any of the images, all of that can be stored in the static folder. Right, within this I'm going to create certain file called CSS, certain folder. Right, I'm going to create a file called static.css. In this, I'm just going to give certain, if at all, if it sees a body, I'm going to define certain style. I'm going to define certain style. Right, the background color, I'm going to use certain, if it is a ash color. Right, I'm defining my CSS. If you know, if you learned CSS, this is basic stylings that I am trying to use. Right. Yeah. That's it. I'm just going to use this. Right, and for if at all, if it sees the h1 tag, I'm saying like, apply this styles, which is color. I'm going to use green. I'm going to use green. Right, so from this template, right, we have this HTML and we have used the h1 tag, right, and this is in the black color. Now what we are going to do here is, right, what we are going to do here is, right, we are saying now when I load this particular page, I have to apply the styles. I have to apply the styles. Let us see if it applies these styles. Okay, is it in a green color? No, right? This has not come in the green color, but in the CSS, I did mention that it is a green color. But in this index.html, did I mention that where to get my CSS from? No, I did not. Right, so here in the head tag, I'm going to introduce my CSS. I'm going to introduce my CSS. So CSS, if I have to add any external CSS, I have to use a tag called link. And I'm going to say, what is this? It is a style sheet. It is a style sheet, meaning it is a CSS. And where should it get the CSS from? And I'm going to say, right, URL underscore for static. So URL for static is again, okay, so URL for, and within that I have to say static. And now this URL for is basically a Flask specific function which will resolve the static URL. So, right, it will now, when the moment you say it look at the static folder, it looks at the static folder and tries to get this particular static.css, right? Look into the static folder. And what is the file name that you have to get? What is the file name that you have to get? Right, file name, what did we say? Static.css, right? And let me close this function call. Let me close this function call. Now I've told that, right, find the CSS required for this page in this path, in this path. URL for, again, when rendering this particular HTML, when rendering this particular HTML, right, your Python will resolve this with a proper path. Let us see what happens in the browser now. Let me just reload this. Is it green now?
Yes, sir.
Right, let us look at the use. Right, so this whatever link that we have added has resolved something like this, has resolved something like this, which means this has been resolved to this, this has been resolved to this, because now it, you said you have to go look for a static folder, right? Your Python and Python Flask framework understood. Okay, then which means this file name static.css is there in the static folder, and it will replace that with the static, with this respective folder structure, right? And the path where it can find the static CSS, static CSS. Now, if I have to make certain change, right, all I have to change is like my CSS file, right? I don't have to change my code, and that's it. If I reload this, instead of green, I'll get it blue, right? Because I have updated my CSS. Yeah, either it is a CSS or a JavaScript or anything, right? You have to, right, create a folder called static, and you have to place your static files, either it is a CSS files or images or a JavaScript file that is used to render the front end. You have to place them in the static folder, and all the HTMLs should be placed under the templates folder. All the HTML files should be placed under the template folder. All right. So any questions so far? Did we understand?